This final Provost Distinguished Faculty Lecture of the academic year. We're very, very grateful for your attendance today. My name is Nathan Lindsay. I'm the Associate Provost for Dynamic Learning, and I'm here on behalf of our Interim Provost, Beverly Edmond, to welcome you to this. Unfortunately, she's out of town and wishes she could be here. This lecture series celebrates University of Montana faculty who have been nationally and internationally recognized for their scholarly achievements. And the purpose of the series is to share with the exciting accomplishments of our faculty with the broader Missoula and community groups. This presentation is being recorded by Missoula Community Access Television as part of a media assistance grant donated by MCAT. We thank them for that. I'm very, very excited for the speaker this afternoon, and it's our own award-winning Dr. Cara Nelson. And I'd now like to invite Regents Professor Stephen Running to come forward and provide our introduction.
All right, and Cara said I could say anything I wanted. So, Cara's been professor here since 2007, came from the University of Washington, so she's now an associate professor here. I think particularly relevant to her seminar today is she's been a part of and the chair of the Society for Ecological Restoration for from 2013 to 2015. This is an organization with members in 70 different countries, so this is a broad international organization. I think before I turn it over to Cara, I just want to make a comment on ecological restoration as a topic that I think might be useful context. When I was taking ecology classes in the 1970s, we basically always studied pristine areas. We'd put our study sites in the nice forest. We'd do our sampling, even when we weren't thinking about it. We just always were really doing our science in the best ecosystems that we could find. And it wasn't until I looked up, I think SEJ started in 1994, and I think it was right around the end of the 80s that I think the ecology community started realizing that just studying the pristine ecosystems is not good enough. I mean, all our global models had perfect ecosystems. The climate models today even still act as if there's no humans on the planet. And so this was a prejudice. Yeah, they do. There's no humans in a GCM. It took ecology as a discipline until around the late 80s to realize that most of the planet isn't pristine anymore. We have carcinogenic chemicals measured on the South Pole nowadays. And so this whole topic of ecological restoration just got started, and I think you were probably right there in some of the first cohorts of ecologists that said, we got to start studying and working on the other end of the spectrum, not just the pristine wilderness ecosystems that are textbook perfect. And so I find this whole topic of ecological restoration gets more relevant by the decade as we look at our planet deteriorating by the decade, to be blunt about it. And so I think her title for today, and I think this topic is just getting more relevant all the time, is we have an awful lot of ecosystems that really are severely damaged, and we've got to see how we can bring them back to life in various ways. That's what ecological restoration's about. And Cara, as the past president of the society, who better to hear from in the whole country than Cara? And here we are.
Thank you, Steve. That was very sweet. I am really excited to be here today with all of you, not just because it's a chance to talk about ecological restoration and some of the key challenges that I hear repeatedly in my ramblings around the different places I've had an opportunity to visit, but also because the entire last year I was in Chile. And so I'm just fresh back to campus with a fresh set of ideas about ecological restoration and how they're playing out on the global stage. And so what I'm going to do today is to talk about what is going on in the field of ecological restoration, because it's been a remarkable transition over the last 10 to 15 years. And then, of course, I have to give some examples from Chile. This is a picture of an Araucaria forest. It's a threatened forest type in Chile, where I spent my last year, critical for restoration. And I have two basic themes, these two challenges that I'm going to touch on. And both of them, what they have in common is lack of application of ecological knowledge into this management practice of ecological restoration. So that's really the goal of my talk today. Okay. So Steve set me up really nicely to talk about when restoration really took off. And of course, people were doing restoration, that's the repair of degraded ecosystems, for over 100 years, probably even longer than that. And someone very high profile who can be thought of as one of the fathers of restoration is John Curtis, who was a very, very important ecologist. I know there's a few ecologists in the room. That's John Curtis of Bray Curtis Ordination. And so in doing the practice of ecological restoration, which he was hired to do, hired by Aldo Leopold at the University of Wisconsin, and his task for his career was to reassemble the plant communities of Wisconsin in the university's arboretum. And in doing that, he made some of the most important advances in community ecology. However, at the time that Curtis was working, the risk involved in ecological restoration was pretty low, right? If he screwed up, it was limited to the University of Wisconsin Arboretum or these other postage stamp parcels. That was the scale and scope of ecological restoration at the time. Turn the clock, and I'm sure all of you, regardless of your major walk of life, where you come from, if you're in the West, you know about different restoration initiatives. I think this mic does not sound very good. It's okay? All right. So, for instance, in a period of 5 years, 44,000 forest restoration treatments were implemented on federal lands in the 11 western states. That's a lot of area. Also, we have a really high-profile restoration example here in Missoula. Many of you know what this is. It's the Berkeley Pit in Butte. We have a history of mine contamination on the Clark Fork River. And if you look at this image of the current Clark Fork River, it looks a little not natural. That's because it's engineered. And it was engineered because of the need to remove toxic mine waste that came and backed up against a dam that was there about 100 years ago, to get rid of that waste and then to move the Clark Fork River into a new channel so that the floodplain could function. That's a really amazing project. And one of the neat things about that project is that in addition to restoring the floodplain ecosystem, the water for aquatic species, drinking water for the human communities who live there, it also provided jobs. And while the project cost $200 million, our local community gained $300 million. So we made money in doing this large-scale restoration program. This promise of restoration over the last 20 years has bloomed into really important global initiatives. And right now, ecological restoration is the primary tool for conservation across the globe. And there's some really, really cool things happening here in our country, but in other countries as well. For instance, This is the cover of the United Nations Convention of Biological Diversity Strategic Plan. And they have an actual strategic target to repair 15% of degraded ecosystems in every nation by 2020. And this is their 2010 strategic plan. That is pretty bold. And different nations are making pledges. I talked to some folks who were here on campus a couple years ago after I got back from Kuwait. Kuwait is planning to restore 15% of their degraded ecosystems. And as part of that, these are trees growing in a common garden from the only individual tree of a native species left in Kuwait. Okay, do you guys hear that? There's one individual of a native tree in Kuwait, and they're now developing common gardens and thinking about bringing seed. Yeah. Okay. Also, for those of you who work in forest ecosystems, similarly in 2010, the IUCN created another challenge as part of these Aichi strategic targets to restore 150 million hectares of forest land, also by 2020. And countries are pledging. This actually is a little bit of an old graph. I think we're up to 80% now. I think it was 60 when I made this graph. The US is 10% of the total target. But last year I was in Chile. I had a chance to go to Ecuador, Colombia, Costa Rica, and help on national restoration plans. All these countries are developing national restoration plans because they pledged through something called the 20 by 20 agreement. And look at this. All these countries pledged. Chile pledged 500,000 hectares of forest restoration to occur by 2020. So this is really now a very large movement. I promised a few tidbits from Chile, so I wanted to, they're kind of peppered throughout, but Chile is a biodiversity hotspot. It has really, really high levels of endemism, and that's because of where it's located on the globe. In addition, it has half of all the temperate forests in the southern half of our planet, in the southern hemisphere. And so there's some really compelling restoration stories there, including the amazing Araucaria forests. They have the most southern species of palm on the globe, also critically threatened. And finally, Nothofagus alessandri, in which there's only, this is the southern beech type, only a few remaining patches of this type on the planet. So why is that? It's because of this crazy rate of conversion from native forest into plantations, which is a story we've seen throughout the globe. And in many places besides the western United States, what's being planted is in plantations is not native species. So in Chile, it's non-native pines from the US and eucalyptus. And this is what it looks like at a landscape scale. And this is what it looks like from a GIS map perspective. This is southern Chile, south central Chile. You can see where in my little inset map. And this is native forest in green in 1975. And here it is in 2000. The brown is plantations. And that's in a 25-year period. So you can see the tremendous threat. And this is something I'll pick up on again when we get to the end. So here we have this Bonn challenge, and it's amazing. We can all celebrate that we have these targets. Or can we? What are we actually doing to accomplish ecological restoration? And what are the challenges that may prevent us from achieving biodiversity conservation and the real repair of degraded ecosystems? And of course, as I mentioned, as you go from the individual patch at University of Wisconsin to the 44,000 treatments going on in the western US in a 5-year period to the 150 million hectares across the globe and the over $3 trillion that we're spending, this is really a very, very large experiment. And we hope that we can bring in as much as we know about ecological science to improve the potential for success. And so the goal of my talk today, in an effort to keep from sliding down. If some of you have kids, the Chutes and Ladders game, right? So frustrating. Your 3-year-old, they cry, right, when they go down, right? Avoiding those ladders to slide back down, because we would like 100 years from now our children's children's children to say, we're so glad we spent that $3 trillion every year at the turn of the century, rather than, well, we tried some stuff and maybe we made some mistakes. So here's my 2 topics. Topic number 1, setting restoration targets that recognize the dynamic nature of ecosystems. My second is building ecological complexity into restoration goals. So both of these topics start with inherent properties of ecosystems. You can imagine this ecosystem, and if you built it and you came back a couple months, it's going to look different. And generally, when people describe the characteristics of ecosystems, they talk about the composition, what's in it, the structure, how is it ordered, and sometimes the function. How is the ecosystem, what kind of work is it performing, what are rates and fluxes of things coming to and out of the system? What is often left out, especially in the context of management, is this other inherent property of ecosystems, which is that they change, which is actually very inconvenient from a management perspective. So we know that there was ice, 3 miles thick of ice across North America for periods of time. But I think it's hard today, especially for students, to realize how far we have come in terms of understanding ecological theory. This has been a central goal of ecologists for the last 100 years, is understanding ecosystem assembly. Started from ideas of Clements, thinking that things should be where they are because they're supposed to be there. Communities have individuals that are all supposed to be together, so if you just figure out what's supposed to be where, then you're good. To recognition, and it was very controversial, that communities actually don't operate as a whole, but are the sum of the individual parts. And it wasn't until much later that Whitaker ran these long transects in space, where he was able to show that different species performed better in different environments. Seems really obvious, doesn't it? And so what this graph is showing, my pointer doesn't really work, but the peak of each of those traces is where the species has the highest stems per acre. And you can see how that varies across the moisture gradient. Well, now, more recently, we're able to see really long time records, and we have a paleo lab here who are experts in looking at these really long time series in vegetation change. And so how this works is that pollen looks different, and it gets preserved in lake sediment. And so you can look at a series, in this case, from a lake in Washington that spans 20,000 years. And the information you get from these lake sediment cores is pollen abundance. And what this graph shows is the percentage of pollen at various points, years before present, for different species. And those species are ordered along the top. And what's really interesting is that from 13,000 to 10,000 years ago, you see a lot of pine. And this is from a lake by the University of Washington. Then something happened and that pine dropped out, right? The climate changed. And we see it became hotter, warmer, and there's more alder, grasses, and ferns. And then another change, 6,000 years ago, the hypsothermal, and you see the wetter climate and the development of the flora that's there today. So what this means really is that as our world is changing, our climate is changing, our ecological communities are changing, and it really throws this idea that was had its heyday in the latter half of the last century of a natural range of variation into question, right? It doesn't really make sense because we don't have a planet that stays within particular ranges. You can quantify historic range, and that is very useful to know the historic range of variation. It's just for management, there's not a natural range or a way things are supposed to be. So, this property of temporal change, how do you map it into a management framework? What it means is that we can't possibly have the goal of maintaining systems stable forever, right? Holding our world constant at any particular period in time. So here's a schematic to show that. We've got ecosystem condition. We have a big bubble because it's a biophysical envelope that your system can be in. And then we have a degraded state. Is restoration about this? No, of course not. Instead, restoration is about removing degradation and returning the system to the condition it would have been in if it hadn't have been degraded. That's a lot of subjunctives in that sentence, right? And so we need to know how you figure out what that is. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but before I do, there's so much confusion among managers about this concept of ecological restoration. And here's an example. I could pull lots of these, but here's a paper, and it says, ecological restoration seeks to restore the vegetation structure and composition as it was prior to its disturbance, right? So I chose to talk about this because it's such an important concept for ecological restoration for our $3 trillion that we're spending every year. So here's our target. This condition the system would have been in if it hadn't have been degraded. How do you figure out what that was? Well, there's one easy approach. If you're lucky and you live in an area where Steve likes to work in the intact systems, right? You can find modern analogs. These are areas that are similar to your project site, except they haven't been degraded. This is best practice approach in ecological restoration. But there's also a lot of confusion here because no two ecosystems are alike, right? So can you just find one other place on a landscape and assume that it is going to represent the mean condition for your project site? Well, it's not a good approach. So instead of selecting a single reference site, there's a need to create a reference model that recognizes variation in the attributes that are important to the functioning of that system. So you can see this here. Here's 4 sites I picked from a project. They were all typed the same way, and you can see they vary both in composition. They also vary in terms of their spatial structure. And that variation in structure is going to lead to variation in function. And it's just basically understanding heterogeneity and how that relates to your precision of estimation. And this is best practice for identifying a reference model rather than a reference site. Here we see some recent examples from the literature where people took a single site approach. So here we have studies, here's my pointer working, and total number of plots per stand, number of stands per forest type, number of forest types. And you can see that many people are putting in a single plot to develop their approach to a reference. And this is really important because we're making decisions, for instance, on how we are going to be planting native forests in Chile, right? Based on a reference of potentially a single plot. So part of what I was doing in Chile was working on reference models for 7 different native forest ecosystems. It was really a fantastic project to work on because I got to do a survey of some of these really beautiful forest types in Chile. Okay, just quickly, some other things for those of you who work in restoration and you're thinking about reference models. You also have to worry about successional development, right? Ecology, community ecology spends a lot of time talking about assembly and succession. And it can't be ignored, again, when you map onto a management framework. Because, of course, many restoration projects are in early seral stages. They've been recently disturbed. So it doesn't really make sense to have your reference model be a late seral ecosystem, because there's several different communities that are going to assemble and reassemble along the way. So often there's this disconnect between the seral stage of your project site and of your reference site. And the last one that I wanted to mention concerning these reference models is equilibrium dynamics. And this just goes, what I'm going to talk about here goes to show how far we've come in our ideas and understanding about ecosystems, because we moved from clements, things are with the species they're supposed to be with over time, to recognition that disturbance is a key attribute of a system and disturbance regimes, to the understanding that successional development is often not deterministic. Instead, there could be multiple pathways that would lead to different ecosystems that develop on the same site. For instance, if you're in Alaska, in an area low productivity and not too many species, you may, regardless of the condition your system is in after some kind of perturbation, you may see assembly occur in the exact same way regardless of the order of species introduction. And this is displayed here. Here's my pointer, where we have A and B, two different states of an ecosystem, converge on C and go to D, where it's a stable community for a period of time. Here we have a similar scenario, although the routing is different, but you have the system eventually ending up in the stable state, regardless of the order of species introductions. In other kinds of systems, and I've picked a really species-diverse California grassland, you would expect to see multiple equilibrium states. And you can see this in this figure. Here, these two states never converge, and here, they never reach equilibrium. And this is really, really important for setting ecosystem targets for ecological restoration. Okay, so I mentioned that in some places we're lucky to have these modern analogs that we can use to build reference ecosystems. They're not available in some locations. And an example from Chile would be Nothofagus alessandri. Those forests, they're worth only 3 patches left until recently. And so there's other approaches that you can use to create reference models, including using historical information. And the two different approaches, and sometimes they're combined, have different types of error associated with them. If you're using modern analogs, other sites around the landscape, you have spatial error because no two ecosystems are alike. If, on the other hand, you're using historic information, you have temporal error because, as we've said, ecosystems are dynamic. And so what I've been referring to in terms of this temporal error, I've been talking about ecological time. Because 50 years is a different period of time depending on what ecosystem you're in. So for example, if I had a complete data set from the Yellowstone River from last summer, and I collected 4,000 variables at 30 sites, and then there was an oil spill, and the state called me and said, we would like to hire your lab to develop a restoration plan and set targets. Would I say, I can't use historic information from last year because it's old, I need to find modern analogs? No, of course not. It's only been 1 year. That data is still relevant. What if it was 10 years old? What if it was 100 years old? What if it was 1,000 years old? Well, that what if and the answer to it varies depending on what kind of a system you're in. If you're in a lodgepole pine forest, it's going to be very different than if you're in Churchill, Manitoba. So in thinking about how to develop a reference model, there's a need to evaluate spatial and temporal error. But the goal is the same, the condition your system would have been in if it had not have been degraded. Adding complexity, however, is the fact that we are experiencing rapid environmental change. My lab works on the science behind the selection of native plant materials and gene ecological studies. And something that's really important to that is seed hardiness zones. And this is a map of seed hardiness zone changes between 1990 and 2006. So in a 15-year period, almost everywhere in the US changed one seed hardiness zone. Clearly has important implications for this concept of local adaptation and our targets for ecological restoration. This is an area that's really interesting for research right now, and I'm really, really pleased that University of Montana now has growth chambers that are getting installed soon where we will be able to increase our ability to test ecotypic variation under different climate scenarios. Okay, onto this second challenge, which gets at ecological complexity. Another issue that is really difficult to map correctly in a management or onto a management context. And of course, complexity and interdependency is another inherent characteristic of ecosystems. We could spend a lot of time talking about this topic, but instead, just one slide with a great example is the feedbacks between plants and soils. Soils are affected by plants and the roots that are there, the mycorrhizae, the root exudates. The plants affect the structure, the chemical composition, and the biological community in soils. And those affect the types of plants that can grow on that landscape. So what does this mean, this interdependency mean for ecological restoration? Well, let's take a look at the Bonn Challenge map. And this map was created based on the locations where trees could grow. And the major goal for some of the stakeholders in the Bonn Challenge are really fiber and carbon. And so this is an ecosystem goods and services approach. And sometimes a single good or service is emphasized. This is what I saw when I left Chile. It actually is not a photo from the airplane, but I left Chile in the midst of the worst wildfires in South America in recorded history. And ironically, or tragically, 500 million hectares of forest land burned. That's the same amount that they pledged in the 20 by 20 agreement. And the reason that it burned, this is in the same region, here's some stories from the paper, is because of these plantations, which are pine and eucalyptus. This is not a fire-dependent ecosystem. It does not have a natural history of fire. And so when fire burns, it just burns through this landscape. So the conversation now in Chile is about restoring the plantations and whether that's going to count for the 20 by 20, because there are some people who think this goods and services approach is the right way to go with ecological restoration. Here's a picture of what some of these plantations look like, pine plantations. And of course, you can see this, there's not a lot of biodiversity protection going on in these forests. Compared to the native beech forest, which is of course structurally very, very different. And so, in my view, what we know about ecological complexity and ecological interconnectedness means, of course, that we need to have broad ecological targets. And this is from a recent document released by the Society for Ecological Restoration. We're really pleased to have it for the international community. And it represents standards for ecological restoration. So species composition, community structure and function, external exchanges, gets at interaction across the landscape, threats, physical conditions. And so as you're designing ecological restoration, even if you have goals to get goods and services from your project, in order to maximize those goods and services, you need to, in your project plan, include the complexity of your ecosystem. Here's another example, not from Chile, but back here, where the pines are actually native. We have the opposite problem in Chile, where their restoration is focusing on planting trees. Our forest restoration is focused on removing trees because we have a history of fire suppression. And much of our restoration is occurring because of concern over wildfire. So you can argue that we also have kind of a single service approach to what we do for forest restoration. Not that this service isn't important. You know, we live in the West, and it's critically important to reduce fire hazard in our forest ecosystems. Based on an evaluation that I did of these 44,000 treatments implemented over a 5-year period, well, let's go back for a second. So here we have all of these treatments that were implemented, and I just wanted to point out what they're doing is removing trees mechanically or doing prescribed burning. And what we call the wood that we remove is fuel, right? So what we're doing for restoration is we're removing fuel from our system. Another thing we could say is we're removing future soil wood, because this wood is critically important to our ecosystems. And any of you who've been out in our forests know that you see these rich hummocks and mounds, and it's hard to say any area that isn't chock full of soil wood. I know when I was trying to get native plants to grow in my garden and having these repeat failures, I finally got some chunks of moist, dug for rotten logs and built them into my soil, and all of a sudden these clonal native plants were able to thrive in the ecosystem. And we know there's other non-target effects of doing some of these management activities. One of them is invasive weeds such as cheatgrass. So one thing that I looked at with colleagues several years ago is the probability that treated stands will burn after treatment in a reasonable lifespan. And how it turns out is it's a relatively low probability that the areas that you treat will experience a subsequent wildfire within the relevant treatment lifespan. And that's what this graph is showing, where the percent of treatment area that burned after the treatment was implemented for most of the 11 Western states is between 0 and 10%. There were a few areas that had a higher number than that. But on average, the areas that are treated will not experience wildfire. What that suggests is not that we shouldn't be implementing treatments for wildfire hazard reduction, but rather that we need a broader set of goals for these areas. And so, for the second point, we need to manage for ecological complexity. Have that be the overarching goal of ecological restoration. And then, if we take that approach, we're likely to have a larger range of goods and services to flow from our ecosystems over a longer period of time. I just wanted to kind of, getting into wrap up here, talk about some of the tools that the Society for Ecological Restoration has that are new for improving our ability to achieve biodiversity conservation through global restoration initiatives. One of them I already mentioned is our international standards, and the citation is up here. It's available off the website, www.ser.org, if you want to look for it, or you can email me and I can send it to you. And this is a tool not just for planning, but also for assessing ecological restoration. And so in this instance, on this figure, you can see different achievements from 1 to 5 in these different areas of restoration. We are also really pleased to announce that we have a certification program for practitioners of ecological restoration that was just launched this year. And this is an opportunity for students to become certified as in training and professionals to become certified at the professional level. So we are on this journey where the public across the globe has agreed that we want to invest in ecological restoration. There's a ton of excitement about the field. There is a huge workforce that's ready to engage. And what we need now is to make sure that we bring a level of inquiry and excitement to find out how our activities and actions are playing out on the landscape and how we can improve what we're doing. And for me, what's exciting to be here at University of Montana is that we have a chance to work with students and to train students in both the ecological aspects and the management aspects of the field, because it's really bringing together those two that is going to help us have the best journey possible. So thank you. And I think we have time for questions. Yeah.
So the 15% international goal is super exciting,
Yes.
super ambitious. But as you talked about, is there any way of kind of monitoring what people are saying will actually count as restoration so that we don't end up with 8 of that 15% being eucalyptus plantations?
This is what the international community is grappling with now, because there's validating what will and will not count, and then there's validating the effects and effectiveness of the treatments. So those are two kind of separate parts. Documents like the SER standards are going to really help in broadening how people are thinking about ecological restoration. But one of the problems that I could have chosen in terms of a key challenge is that we have most of the policies being set at the 10,000 foot scale, and often they're not being done in connection with the experts who have made their careers in ecological restoration, right? So the large body of people who are in the know about how you accomplish restoration are a little disconnected from the people who are driving the process, because now, of course, it's being done at the level of the environmental ministers from the different countries. And so, again, Dan's on the board of the Society for Ecological Restoration as well. We have a conference in Brazil this summer in August, and one of the goals of that conference is to connect, top down, bottom up, and try to get everybody in the room and sort of democratize what's going on within the field. Yeah.
So building on that, but not necessarily the eucalyptus example, but where the people at that ground level do have a proposed strategy.
Yeah.
But the funding's not there to align with that. So the partners come together and agree to a suboptimal approach forward that might compromise the long-term objectives. How do you respond to that? I feel like that's a limited world that happens with their bit.
Well, that's a great question, and I think part of your question is, where is it appropriate, or where are we reserving true holistic restoration for, and what about all those other activities that are restorative? And I think it's really important to have a big tent, right, in terms of restorative activities, but to be very clear in the definition of ecological restoration so we can reserve at least a portion of what's going on under that big tent for areas like for us in Montana, where we have the opportunity to really repair some of our degraded ecosystems in a way that other places on the planet may not be able to. Yeah, but these are decisions that are really social decisions, right? And as we make these social decisions, the ecological community, I think, needs to be prepared to engage so that when we hear people say, we have a management plan that's going to hold the world at 1863 forever, it's an opportunity to talk about what we know about ecosystems and where we've come in terms of our learning about community assembly. Yeah.
So, in river restoration, which there's hundreds of billions of dollars spent every year.
Yeah.
There's wide recognition that most streams are highly valuable.
Yes.
Yet a good portion of the restoration that is done is focused on establishing structures so that the stream looks right.
Right.
But very little is done to actually try and re-engage the process.
Right.
Is that, do you find that to be, first of all, is that also the case in terrestrial systems?
Yes.
That are primarily, are they as process-driven as what green systems are? And if they are, is that something that you run up against as well with terrestrial systems?
Absolutely. And I think the fundamental problem is that we have, there's several problems. One is that change is difficult for the human brain. We can think in 3 dimensions, not n dimensions. And so it's just inherently a hard thing to do to manage for change. But that might not be solvable, characteristics of the human brain. But what is solvable, I think, is bringing a higher knowledge base of the ecology of whatever kind of ecosystem you're working on to your restoration or your management projects. And I think if we have a better basis in ecological theory, in the practice of ecological restoration, we're going to be making better decisions and having better outcomes. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think the fact that I picked these 2 topics, which are about complexity and change, to highlight, I chose to highlight them because I think they're the most serious issues facing restoration and our ability to succeed.
So one thing I'm thinking about is how can we keep in mind this complexity and this dynamism, but also a lot of the motivation for restoring ecosystems does have to do with services that it can provide for humans.
Absolutely.
So, obviously there's no easy answer, but, how do we reconcile those things? And is it possible to restore to complexity and maintain complexity, but still provide services that people want?
I think that we are not able to provide those services unless we manage for temporal change and complexity over the long run. And so it's a little bit of a nuanced argument, because what I'm trying to say is not that we shouldn't get goods and services from our restoration projects. I actually think restoration will fail unless we're able to get goods and services from our landscape. But rather that the approach to getting those goods and services over the long term is having at its core the goal of restoration, your project design, being ecological complexity and in recognition of temporal change. So another way to say that is managing in accordance with what we know about ecosystems. Managing the ecosystem is going to provide the greatest bang for the buck. And this is not a new concept. For those of you who work in forest ecosystems and followed the changes to the National Planning Rule under the Clinton era, he put together a committee of scientists to work on the forest planning rule. And the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, you guys remember this, says all the things, goods and services we get from our national forests, they're listed alphabetically, right? And my understanding is they were listed alphabetically to say that one was not more important than the other: aesthetics, recreation, timber, et cetera. And what this committee of scientists did in the mid-90s was to say that unless we manage for ecological sustainability, we won't be able to get any of those things from the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act. And so that ecological sustainability should be they called it the guiding star or something like that of our forest management program. And I think it makes a lot of sense that we need to, as we're trying to do ecosystem management, focus on managing in a way that's consistent with what we know about ecosystems. Of course, it's a little tricky because our knowledge about ecosystem dynamics has changed so much in the last 100 years, but it means that we need to have a close interplay between science and management. Yeah.
I guess Billy on that, specifically, how have you found that focus working with another rainforest?
Your way to say again?
How do you find that, like that focus of ecological restoration? How does that like work with, trying to get with a bunch of loggers that are managing the plantations and developing the rainforest? Is that...
Okay, that's a great question. It's a little outside of my sphere because the folks, my understanding is that within all of Chile, the people who are doing the timber harvesting they're not harvesting native forests anymore. It's all plantations and it's all very, very large companies. So those companies are actually driving a lot of the restoration, and it's being done through the Forest Stewardship Council, which is a certification program for forest management. And so even though these companies are planting exotics, they can get certified as a sustainable forestry operation if they do a certain amount of restoration. And so they're actually funding much of the restoration research, including work such as trying to figure out reference ecosystems so that they can sell their forest products as certified forest products. I don't know if I answered your question, but there's some ideas to think about in terms of what's going on there. Yeah.
One more there. So I was doing a lot with oil and gas before I came here. So I was a lot of find out. One of the things we were trying to get to, get there with oil and gas, especially related to sage-grouse, where a lot of it pasture mountain was this idea of, so I don't know to the extent that it's accounting for complexity and feature equity appropriately, but where there could be defined some kind of desired feature restoration state.
Yeah.
So you come to that, but the difference was we would like mitigation or restoration to be satisfied when that state's accomplished. The energy companies don't like that because there's lack of financial certainty or long-term commitment. So they're arguing for a cookbook recipe, we will do this. And
finish your project.
Right.
You met the goal,
I think that was just that's a huge big issue, but how much is maybe even site for ecological restoration weighing in on that? Because to me, it's pretty foundational to the reality of the single-layered range. I think about cheatgrass, but just because we try something and the wrong dynamic happens with weather that year, we all know there's a waste, there's loss, and we went backwards. But the energy company still gets that, hey, we still spent the money, we did our part, but actually we didn't accomplish it.
Right. So this connects very well to Dan's question in terms of what counts, and you're adding, when does it count? When are you going to count that accomplishment? And this is something that the global community is really grappling with right now. And the Forest Stewardship Council, or the folks who do carbon credits, have dealt with the same issue in terms of monitoring and verification. And so within the field of restoration, we need all that stuff. And we need it 5 years ago. And it's a really, really active time with a lot of players trying to come together to solve some of these questions. And there's been some talk within people within the society about having a project level certification. Yeah, so for those of you who are still figuring out your career paths, restoration is an amazing field to go into right now. Not just because there's so much to be done, but also, I would argue, because of the complexities. There's really a need for people who are smart, interested in inquiry, and interested in solving problems. And there's also opportunities across the globe.
Getting right to the most practical thing.
Yes.
People want to have, graduate from college and get a job.
Yes. You would like a job. Great. Well, thank you so much. Oh, do you have another question?
You talk about the importance of that ecologist and manager relationship. What do you see as some of the best or opportunities for the best methods of communicating and fostering that relationship and kind of tapping into that or influencing the institutional and like that foundation knowledge?
Well, I really think it requires a cultural shift. People say there's not enough money to do monitoring, that's why we don't monitor. But I really don't think it's true. I really think it's about a culture of inquiry and having people who are trained to understand how you ask and answer a question. Because some forms of monitoring, some things that happen in my lab cost almost no money and are done by undergraduates and are providing really, really useful information. And so I think we need to work towards a culture where everyone who's managing ecosystems is empowered to ask and answer these questions and knows how to do it. But there was another thing I want to say. There's something that's a little harder to do, which is that in order to innovate science into practice, it's really necessary to provide cookbooks. Something I was talking with Rick about. So if you look in stream restoration, the Roskin method took off. Why did it take off? Was it the best approach? There was a step-by-step guide which someone could follow. So if you want to bake a souffle, you need a recipe that's going to tell you exactly what to do, not just that eggs are important or complexity is important in your souffle, right? And so as we make scientific innovations, the academic community or who's ever doing research or whoever is generating knowledge, if they can take that next step and create the cookbook that they can hand off and someone can implement, then I think we'll be able to see that translation. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much. This was really fun.